pleasantries. Remember that time I tried to kill you? The Avenue of Cedars was also the scene where, the site where Marion finally dismissed his troops. This was December 15th, 1782, the day after the British evacuated. There was a big celebration in Charlestown. The town fathers did not invite the militia to attend, however. The militia, of course, were not properly dressed for such an occasion and probably were in very high spirits, or maybe high in other ways as well. Marion could have gone. He was also had a commission as a continental officer, but he chose to stay with his men and dismiss them in person. And William Dobain James tells us in his favorite encampment at Wadbu, and on the side of the cedar trees, he thanked his officers and men for their many and useful services and bid them a friendly and affectionate farewell. Marion was not famous for his soaring oratory, so nobody bothered to write down his words, but he did issue in his general orders of that day a farewell to his men, and we can get some idea of what he might have said to his men from that, and especially this passage here, in which he says, "You'll always consider them with affection of a brother soldiers, and happy to render them every service in his power, and you cannot doubt in the least their readiness to turn out should their country be ever again so unhappy as to be invaded by her cruel and barbarous enemies." And I'm going to give the microphone to Charles, who will try to answer any of your questions and also contradict everything I just told you.
Thank you so much, Leon. I did have a few comments that I wanted to make. The first one is that Leon was actually there in 1710 and took that photograph. Except that instead of being an avenue of cedars, it was just an avenue of Christmas trees. We were extremely fortunate to find the map that showed the avenue. Leon found that, and this is always my advice to historians. You never know what you're going to find till you look. And nobody ever knew where that avenue was. And there is another map that was drawn, a plat that was drawn about 6 or 8 years later, not on there. So you had to find that one. And Leon, as a biologist, has told me that as soon as the area freezes over 2 or 3 times, he's going to try to go in there and see if there are any descendants of the avenue still residing in those woods. The second thing I wanted to let you know, and to reiterate a point that Karen first hit on in her initial talk, and that is that the militia turned out for Charleston in 1784 to quell riots. Well, what the citizens of Charleston did to Marion's brigade is really unthinkable, because they specifically did not invite them to the celebration. They specifically did not invite Francis Marion. Greene knew that this was a terrible slight. Greene personally invited Marion to go with him, and Marion said no thanks. So only 2 years later, Charleston needs Marion's brigade again, as Karen pointed out in her talk. And those men, though slighted by the fathers of Charleston, turned out again to save the town once again. So it's interesting. The world is a big round place, as we all know. And as they say, what goes around comes around. It'll be fascinating to do some more archaeology on the site. A lot of these battlefields that we work on, like when Rick and I were talking about the Bridges campaign, there's so many of these sites that just don't have any archaeology yet. And we're fortunate to be able to project where we think things will be. And a lot of times I'm really lucky and get it right. But in this particular case, as Leon said, I got exactly down backwards wrong, because I had the avenue going due north to the run of Wadblue Creek. And turned out when Leon stumbled upon the plat, or his brave research uncovered the plat, whichever it was.
Called Google.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to find until you look. So a lot of times people say, well, where can I get those diagrams and what have you? We published this article in April of 2019. That's what it looks like. It's on the website, Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution. And we hope as time goes on that we'll be able to treat most of the major skirmishes and important sites of the American Revolution in South Carolina or in the Carolinas and Georgia to the same kind of treatment, where you actually go out, look, do the research, try to figure out who was there, try to figure out how they could have possibly maneuvered around to make sense of the primary sources, and then publish that for people to read and understand. Now, why do that? Well, a few of us curious about military history want to read this, all three of us. What's really important, though, is this is how we tell our landowners what happened on their land and why their land is important. Now, in South Carolina's most places, the greatest destroyer of cultural heritage sites is the government. Okay? Build highways through it. Thankfully, this one is a very pristine, gorgeous, and beautiful site, as you saw from Pard's aerial drone video. But if people don't know where stuff is, if we don't mark these sites, if we don't publish these papers where they will survive, if folks like Leon are not willing to dig through the records and try to figure it out, put it together, then shame on us. Shame on us for letting it happen. And it's amazing, though, that there are so many sites that we have no clue where they are. We can read about them, but we have no clue. We've got to find them, we've got to mark them, we've got to interpret them, and we've got to tell the landowners, hey, let's preserve this for posterity. And so, thank you so much, Leon, for helping me out. When I get jammed up and haven't got a clue how to put it down, ask Leon. Thank y'all so much. Yes, ma'am. Question?
How did you get the photograph of the house and what happened to it?
Well, that's interesting. Of course, that photograph is not of the house. That's just something Leon made up to demonstrate it. However, as luck would be, there are a couple of folks who are very interested in what both of the Colleton mansions looked like. They were great houses in the English country house tradition. They were built by very wealthy people, and they were built as showplaces. So we've pretty much shaken the trees in South Carolina for references or pictures or paintings or even a letter describing them. But these families still exist in England, and so now we are chasing around private document collections and such to try to find if there happens to be a painting, happens to be somebody's favorite horse painted with that in the background, or at least a letter describing it. Now, the Battleground Trust has bought the site of the mansion that we believe was made of brick on the Monk's Corner side of Biggin Creek called Fairlawn Barony. The site that we showed of Wadblue Barony is in private owners' hands, and they're very much aware of what they have, and I think they're very, very excellent stewards of that property. But hopefully one day, it'll be a few years probably, we'll come back here and maybe have an artistic rendering of both of those great houses. If you've seen Drayton Hall, That's kind of an idea of the scope of these great English country houses that could have been built in this area.
Yeah, we have to.
I do not. We had a kind of a fire at Fairlawn, kind of a little fire that the Americans started. But I think the house survived the fire and was repaired. Do not know what happened to either one of them. That's another thing that needs to be researched. But once again, you never know what you're going to find until you look. And we do have some folks working the problem. Anything more than you wanted to know? I know. Yes, Mr. Ruddy.
What was happening at Fort Fairlawn and the Monk's Corner side in 1782? Were British still there, or had they totally abandoned Monk's Corner?
Well, they hadn't abandoned, they didn't have their post there any longer because there was no reason for a post there. They had, General Leslie had taken command in November of 1781, and we now know that his orders, what they said, the Americans in 1781 didn't know, but he was basically to pull in and defend Charleston, to hold it for the peace negotiation, take no more offensive operations, but to do defensive operations. Now we know that there were some large-scale operations out of Charleston after November 1781, but if you've got thousands of loyalists, their property, civilians in Charleston, soldiers, and their booty that they've stolen, to ship out of Charleston, that takes a bunch of ships. And before you can send off a bunch of ships, you got to have a bunch of food, a bunch of water, all that kind of stuff. So there was a good bit of raiding going on, like when Steve Smith was telling us about Parker's Ferry. That was not a general military campaign against the Americans. They were out raiding for cattle and rice so that they could ship a bunch of loyalists south to Florida, to the British colonies in Florida. That's what they were up to. They were getting food. And see, Charleston was being pretty choked off at that time, so they had to raid out in pretty major force to get food, forage, wood, and all the things you need for the fourth largest city in the colonies to feed them and to keep the cows, the horses, etc. alive. So that's what they have to do. And that's what their orders were. We know. Anybody else?
I have a
Dr. Klein, a small question. Yes, sir.
No. It's a castrate Leon a little bit. You didn't publish that picture of the avenue in your journal, did you? Okay.
No, sir.
If I was his history professor, I would give it back to him and say, get something more out of it.
But Dr. Klein, I told you, Leon was there and took that picture in 1710.
And I want to go there and help find that avenue of things too.
Yeah.
Right, Woody?
Sir,
I'm teasing.
correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there an episode when they were going out collecting fresh water at Hadrian's Point, and Green implied Marion to kind of chase them off, and Marion felt like there was no use in risking life at that point?
I do remember, I don't think it was water they were getting, but I remember what you said. If you read the 1782 siege that Greene laid, and Governor Rutledge and Governor Matthews followed along with it, to try to cut off any commerce with the British. But there was lots of people who felt that the Lord North's government had fallen. It was just a matter of time till they left. And so why not take that British gold and give them food and trade with them? But the official policy of Greene and the state of South Carolina was not to do that. Now, in the Beaufort area, there was a little private truce done, and so the British were supplied in exchange for not burning everything down on Port Royal Island. And so so not all the orders of the government were directly carried out. But there was caution on Marion's was very savvy, and they had a global view, an Atlantic view, as historians would say today. And they believed that the British would eventually be forced out. And so they had a loose siege of Charleston to try to enforce that. Good question. Yes, sir. Anybody else? Tom?
Well, I think some time ago I had read a little description about the conflict at Tidyman's or Tidyman's plantation, and I thought I remembered it being some cavalry charge type things, but it sounds like the archaeological data suggests that didn't happen. That was.
Oh, there was a time. Well, let me redo this once again. Leon and David Nealon, who is here, and I wrote a pretty elaborate paper on what happened at Wambah Creek and the next day at Tidyman's plantation. And so that is on Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution's website. Download it. You got my email address. Let me know if you have any questions. It was not this great cavalry stand and fight to the finish. It was basically at Tidyman's, the British charged and the Americans took off an exit stage right. Colonel Forte.
Sir, it seems that this example here, Leon, was more of a gauntlet than Parker's Ferry in that it was on both sides, correct? Did he establish, or did he anticipate another ambush?
I think it was perhaps an ambush. This was all open field, so he couldn't wait along the path for it. And also Marion didn't have cavalry, so he couldn't have a cavalry charge. So I think Marion decided we'll hide in the trees and see what happens.
And did he have intelligence that he was going up against Major Thomas Frazier again?
We don't know. We know he had intelligence that the British were coming, but I don't know that he knew specifically that it was the Royalists and the Black Dragoons. We don't know that. Now, the other thing that we did not say is that Marion did have a troop of dragoons attached to him under Major Daniel Conyers. And Conyers was out patrolling. And so I think Marion was probably extremely safe where he was and very glad for Frazier to hang around out in that open field and hoping that Conyers would come up. And then Marion's men could attack while Conyers attacked them in the back. But unfortunately, where are those cell phones? Conyers didn't arrive in time. Frazier stayed for about an hour, but Conyers came up much later and chased after the British as they retreated toward UG Bridge, toward the town of crossroads of UG today, and back into Charleston that way. Now I'm going to let Leon tell you one other thing that I think is meritorious.
Can I say that first?
Yes, sir, Dave.
Speaking of, we're...
Dave, come get the mic.
Well, this is really not regarding Conyers and his defense, I want to say this, and this is really clearly to this. Conyers, cell phone, battery, ran out of juice.
I neglected to mention that. Just a couple of points about ambush. Marion did expect Frazier to come back because Frazier got his ammunition and Marion was extremely vulnerable. So that evening they did set an ambush along the route that they thought Frazier was going to come by, and Frazier didn't. The second point is an anecdote Charles encouraged me to tell. And this is written in Traditions and Reminiscences, mainly of the Revolutionary War. And Frazier succeeded in capturing a number of cattle and other livestock to take back to Charlestown. They probably got fewer than he expected to get, however, because there were about 100 cattle, mixed cattle, bulls and cows, that Frazier captured, and they put them in a temporary pen. And the owner of these cattle was lamenting that he lost all of his stock. And then it suddenly occurred to him, I have this bull who's notorious for getting out of pens. He could lift the top bar off a pen with his horns. And maybe they'll come back. And he looked out the window, and here they come. And the narrator of the story says this cattle owner stuttered. And he said, he looked out the window and saw his bull coming down the road with all of his cattle following behind him. So it's kind of nice finishing touch to Fraser's lack of revenge at Watkins Plantation.
Thank y'all so much.